Hi, welcome to a special session of Agenda Awani because London School of Economics and Political Science has dropped into Kuala Lumpur, and I'm here on the sideline of LSE Forum for Asia, and I would like to give you a reflection of all the things that has been discussed at this particular forum, and the best person to do that is the Regius Professor of Economics at LSE, Professor Sir Christopher Pissarides. Thank you so much for making time.
Good evening.
You did exactly that at the end of the forum where you give reflections. So I'm just going to go there, and but I would ask you to take the last one maybe, where we look at international relations and then, but more from the perspective of what the global financial architecture can do to stabilize not only monetary, financial, but also to a large extent how we trade with one another and the mechanisms used. Because if I listen to Andrew Sheng correctly, if the central banks can be allowed to swap out, and then we can really make a better way of connecting to one another as far as financial flows are concerned. So why is that so difficult to do? And that was the president himself, president of LSE, reiterated that when saying that there are fears and anxiety from this forum based on the facts discussed. And why is it that we know what to do, but it's always doing it is another thing entirely? So if you can share your views on that.
Well, first let me tell you how interesting I'm finding this trip, how grateful I am that the London School of Economics, in fact my own institution and the very generous sponsors that we have here, they've given me this opportunity to visit your country. It's my first visit here in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur and Malaysia, and there's always, the first time you visit a place, you're discovering many fascinating things which I'm going to take back home with me and still be thinking about them. And many of those have come up in the discussions we had. It's been a long day, but a very rewarding day. It started, at least for me, it started at 8:30 in the morning, and it lasted a good 10 hours. In fact, all the discussion. And I discovered many things, both about ASEAN in particular, and about the world financial and economic structure. And what I discovered, the main thing I discovered that relates directly to your question, it came up in two sessions that we had, in fact by coincidence in the very first session and in the very last one. And it is that although there are many benefits from economic integration in some regions of the world, and that includes ASEAN, we know we have the example of Europe in the past with the European Union. Of course, even before then, we have the example of the United States with all states coming together. So although there are many economic benefits, as I was saying, sometimes, if not frequently, political interests will block a process that will obviously bring economic benefits to a country, to a group of countries. And that relates also to your question about the financial architecture, in that the current financial architecture is still based on one that was set up immediately after the Second World War, which is, we're now talking more than 60 years ago, close to 70 years ago, in fact, very soon. And it was based on the system we had then, when the United States was by far the dominant economic power. It's still the dominant power, but there is certainly not as big a gap between the United States and the others as we had then. And very soon it will not be the biggest economy in the world. China should overtake. But the growth of China, Japan, South Korea, the other Asian countries, the growth of the European countries has brought some convergence. And yet we still have that system. We still have the dollar as the dominant currency. We still have the IMF as the main institution that will step in and help countries that have big deficits and cannot manage it on their own. We don't have any kind of control on big surpluses, although we know that a surplus or any deficit is matched by a surplus, and surpluses have to be invested somewhere around the world with sort of dubious rates of return, as was said at the meeting. And what we really need, what the economists are saying we really need, is a new structure that will respect the new economic powers in the world. You know, the shifting of power to Asia. It will respect the new fundamental changes taking place, like the changes in demographics, the much bigger role of energy and the new energy sources we're having. But then there doesn't seem to be the political will or the political leaders who will think more global than within their own countries to sit together and devise that new financial structure. The economists, I think, were fairly confident that at least we know what could be done to improve the system, and it's what I mentioned before, and as you mentioned, Andrew Shang mentioned, so direct swaps between central banks, interactions, lending and borrowing and lending between central banks rather than going through the IMF, which might be more speedy and not have the conditionalities of IMF lending. But even that is not something that we can implement quickly. We need political leadership, and we need political willingness to act on that, and we don't seem to have it currently.
I have to go for the first break, but I want to paint the picture for the next one. Never enough time with Nobel laureates and professors. If we can take the experience, the relatively recent experience of Southern Europe, of Greece, Cyprus, for example, and we look at the measures prescribed by the IMF, and if we move back 17 years, and you alluded to that by saying in jest that if only you had come here 1.5 years ago, because in the Prime Minister's speech and remarks that was delivered, you say we refuse to take the medicine prescribed by IMF. And now there's a lot of criticism, if I can put it that way, to the functionality of IMF to really address the needs of the global architecture financially. So when we come back from this short break, if you can give us maybe specific examples from what you are really looking at right now in Southern Europe and the whole issue of the crisis, and how do you get out and recover from the crisis and the bitter pills that you have had to take, that we'll discuss after this short break. You are still watching a special recording of Agenda Awani, and I'm still here with Professor Sir Christopher Pissarides, not only a very distinguished economics professor, but also the winner of a Nobel Prize in 2010. If we have time, we'll go a bit to that before we end, but I would like to come back to you now looking at the measures given by the IMF for especially the southern part of Europe to come out. But there's also big fundamental issues if we read the Spiegel, for example, on how the North, or the biggest economy in EU, they look at the West, the southern part of Europe. So if you can encapsulate all this, maybe in a brief overview to us, from someone who looks at economics, but also directly involved in the prescription of how to manage that for the Southern European part.
Well, essentially, the situation we have now in Europe, of course, it has very complex origins, but to summarize quickly, what there is, we have 18 countries that are using the same currency, and therefore they have a common interest rate. And there is one European Central Bank that is setting those interest rates and choosing monetary policy. Unfortunately, it doesn't have as much control and supervision of individual banks. It's something that is still being debated in Europe, and I do think that progress has been very slow. We need to move faster there. And for a variety of reasons, the southern countries in particular, but also Ireland, so we're talking about Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy to some extent, they've built up big debts. And those were partly built up on the basis of the single currency. They could issue debt in euros, which also included the big economies, especially Germany, but France and others. And we had the European Central Bank backing it up. But they reached a point where debts were so big that lenders started worrying that they might default as countries. You know, there's a sovereign risk of default, and therefore they stopped lending them. And the only solution, the only outcome you could have for that, if they were to stay within the single currency, was to borrow from the other countries in the Union that has surpluses. And the biggest surplus by far was with Germany, or the European Central Bank printing money and giving it to them, which will have pushed prices up. It will have been inflationary, or calling the IMF in cooperation with the European Central Bank and the European Commission to help them out. Now, Germany said it was out of the question that they would transfer directly any of their surpluses, because that was an imposition on German taxpayers, they were saying. The European Central Bank was not allowed by its council, mainly influenced by Germany, in fact, to print currency and buy the debt of those countries, because it would have been inflationary, they're saying. They didn't like the inflation. Therefore, the only route remaining was to borrow from on the IMF conditions, effectively. And those IMF conditions were very strict. They involved cutting the pay to civil servants, those employed by the government. They involved structural reforms that maybe some of them were necessary anyway, but they were requested at high speed. And the outcome of that, and they also involved substantial cutting in public spending and raising of taxes. And the outcome of all that was a very rapid and very fast rise in unemployment. Mm-hmm. In Spain and Greece, you have unemployment close to 30%, mm-hmm. and youth unemployment close to 60%, which is destroying a whole generation of young people. And you might ask, why are we doing this? And the only answer you can give is that, because we don't like inflation. But now we have deflation, and deflation is bad for the economy anyway. So the situation we're finding ourselves now is that there is a group of countries, mainly in the north of the Eurozone, and the group mainly in the south. They require completely different policies for their recoveries. And there is only one central bank and one lender, which is the IMF. Mm-hmm. And the central bank is essentially following the policies that are suited to the northern countries. Mm-hmm. And the southern countries are being subjected to those negative shocks. Yes. They have to deal with that very high unemployment. They have to deal with social unrest. And the whole system is being threatened with breakup. Mm-hmm. Instead of coming closer together as being part of the Union in Europe, we're moving further apart. There is this enmity, this hostility, yes, developing between North and South. And I really don't see any quick solution to it unless there is a fundamental change of policy, which our politicians in Europe are not prepared to.
The economic measures to be taken to solve this are very clear. However, the problems are political and maybe people-to-people perception between the North and the South. It's not an economics issue per se.
It's not. No, it's a political issue. I mean, any economist will tell you that if you suddenly cut public spending in recession, you're going to get a lot of unemployment. Yes. There can be no job creation. There's no demand. Even if you give them incentives to innovate, incentives to improve their technology, when there's no demand, you don't want to produce. Mm-hmm. And
yes,
so it's inevitable, but they're saying, no, it's necessary because it's the only way we could cut the debt. Well, in fact, it's not the only way.
But surely, if the bigger economies of the EU countries look at EU in total, then the answer would be obvious.
Well, the answer would be obvious. They would follow a completely different policy, because if you look at the EU in total, you could see Europe just drifting behind. You know, you now, when you see talk about international economy in today's session, when we're talking about economics, the role of Asia and all that, Europe was hardly ever mentioned.
Yes.
Because it's been in recession for so long, it's growing very slowly. You have one country that is obviously doing very well in exports. You can see German goods everywhere around, but Europe as a whole is doing very poorly. And when you consider the high level of education that we have in Europe, high level of technological knowledge, extremely high levels of income, you know, highest outside the United States, then it's a shame that a continent like that is being subjected to policies that are holding it back from making use of all that potential, and you get such large numbers of young people without a job for several months, if not years, at the end of a very high-level education provided by our schools and our universities.
The economics is supranational, but the political thinking
it's national.
It's national.
Exactly, yeah.
So what would your advice be for regions like ASEAN, for example, going for ahead? I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, we're going to take lessons from there and maybe thinking of new ways, because this is the 21st century. Things are migrating to the service-based economy, knowledge-based economy, for example. What are your views on that? And if we have time, we go back to the Nobel-winning thinking in economics on job search, for example, that after the short break. You are watching a special recording of Agenda Awani on the sideline of the LSE Asia Forum 2014. I would like to thank again Sir Christopher Pizarridis for making time and giving us a reflection of the whole day forum. But I'm going back to Europe. It's very nice to hear from somebody inside who's looking at the economic side. So can I simplify things by saying Europe was ready for economic integration, but however, from the political side, there are issues, because once you are in Brussels, yes, let's look at EU. The moment you go back to each capital state and you just say, we have to look at our voters first, for example.
It's fairly obvious now that when the European integration and in particular the introduction of the single currency happened, Europe was not ready to take on the full responsibility of that very close integration. When we had the liberalizing of trade, movement of labor and capital, the harmonization of many of the rules and regulations that concerned economic relationships, we were ready for that, because all countries could benefit from that in the Union. But when the single European Central Bank was set up and the single currency, we were obviously not ready, because not all countries were prepared to compromise according to the needs of each other in the partnership. We had very pro-European charismatic leaders. They pushed us into that. We all went into it enthusiastically. As soon as the first crisis came, we realized that there wasn't really that willingness to act for the benefit of Europe as a whole. There was much more concern about the individual countries and about the voters in individual countries. So the lesson that I could draw about ASEAN countries and the discussions we had in the LSE forum today is that take it slowly in integrating. It's very important to move closer towards closer economic cooperation. There are also political benefits at the end. current disagreements about the seabed in your region and any others will gradually become less important if you have closer cooperation. But don't push it through into complete integration before you are absolutely sure that that's what you want, that you will be happy to follow a policy in your own country that may not be the best for your own country looked at in isolation, but it might be the best for other countries in your region. If you are not yet prepared to do that, then don't push for full integration the way we've done in Europe.
Professor, I've been talking about gloom and doom so much. Maybe if you can give us one bright silver lining out of all this discussion moving forward for the global economy, because we do know that Asia is rising, it's rising fast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't make me sound completely pessimistic about everything that is going on. You know, Asian economic growth is very fast. It's been fast here because it's been consistently positive for many years. China, of course, is growing and is benefiting everyone through trade, through the supply of inexpensive manufacturing goods, and essentially the current worldwide trend for freer markets and more closely integrated world economy when it comes to trade, especially in the transfer of knowledge, is very positive for the world economy. The emphasis, and in fact, in your Prime Minister's speech this morning, that point was made. The emphasis on the social aspects, that the main benefit from growth is the reduction and hopefully eventual elimination of poverty, should be the priority of policy as well. And we are developing ways, both the economists and the political scientists, of using the fruits of growth to benefit lower incomes in the population, the unemployed and those who are still in poverty. So all these are very positive elements. We're talking more about how close should integration be in a region like ASEAN, or about the finer details of the international.
It sets LSE apart. Institutions and alumni or graduates from institutions like LSE, because you're not just thinking in the economic sphere, because you can argue with people like Awani Westad, for example. So before you go out and prescribe something, you have already taken into consideration the cultural aspect, the political aspect, for example.
Well, you should take it into consideration, and very often we do. Unfortunately, when politicians are listening to our advice, they don't always do something that respects all the different aspects. They sometimes pick something up that they like. It might be the pure economic. They leave something out they don't like, and that's why very often policy fails, although the economic advice behind it or the economic research behind it may not suffer from those same faults.
Professor, I have to wrap up the discussion, but 2010 Nobel Prize for Economics. If I'm searching for a job, it's not just me searching for a higher wage or whatever. It's also the employers looking at the good match between my skills and their productivity.
That's the idea, yeah.
If you can sum it up for us, exactly.
Well, the idea and what gave me the incentive to get into this research is that you very often, in all countries in fact, you observe employers wanting workers and workers wanting work, and yet they don't come together fast enough to form jobs. And before I started this work, and also in collaboration with my colleagues, was the common view was saying, oh, the workers must be lazy, and that's why they're not taking the jobs. So you shouldn't do anything to help them. Just give them a kick in the backside and send them to get the jobs. But in fact, that's not the case. We developed this theory backed up by solid empirical evidence that very often it's the employers who don't want the workers. You need to do something to bring their skills closer to match each other correctly. That's why it's sometimes known as the matching theory. And unless you do that, and then you reject the job after that, you should be supporting the unemployed in various ways, and you should be supporting employers to open the jobs, either subsidizing the labor cost of the employer or helping the unemployed get training or more familiarity with the job that is being opened.
I'm going to learn with that off camera with Professor Sir, but that's all the time we have. Thank you very much to the London School of Economics and Political Science for enabling Astro Awani to do sideline discussions at the Asia Forum 2014. We'll keep in touch with them and we'll keep on bringing thoughts, debates and ideas and discourse like this to you. You can send in your thoughts to all the platforms that we have, ranging from Instagram right up to Facebook and also Twitter, or straight away download our iOS and Android-based application so that you can watch us live, streaming on your favorite mobile gadget. I'll see you in another episode very, very soon. Goodbye. Thank you so much, Professor.